Welcome back to my hand embroidery channel. Today we're going to show you how to do these winter mittens. These have different stitches. I'm going to introduce some new stitches that we haven't talked about on our tutorials yet, so that should be super fun. And if you want help learning some of the basics like the satin stitch or how to use a needle and thread and how embroidery floss works, how to put the fabric in the hoop, all of that stuff is covered in some of our other videos. So make sure to check those out too. And we're gonna just jump right in to these mittens. So first we're gonna stitch this little guy up here in the corner. It's a simple satin stitch. We're gonna use navy blue floss. And something we have to make sure we're doing with the satin stitch is, so we have 3 strands here and we want our stitches to be smooth. So I'm pulling apart all 3 strands. That way I can smooth them out and make sure all those little spinny things are out of that. Then I will just line them up. And we'll put them together. Make sure when you do this that we trim the ends. I'm going to thread my needle. And my knot's tied, so I'm ready to start stitching. I want this mitten to look as much like a real mitten as I can. So I'm going to follow the same sort of directions as this stripe mitten as far as like where my stitches are going to go. So we'll start up here at the top. And just go from side to side. So I've reached the point where the thumb and the main part of the mitten cross. I'm going to show you how we're going to handle that. So I have my thread over here. I'm going to pull it under. And then we're going to make a connecting stitch over here. And I'm putting the needle back down in that same hole where I brought this one down. So it's kind of like a back stitch. And it's a really subtle thing because it looks like it's the same line, but as we work it in, it's gonna look like it's knitted together right there. So now I'll stitch up the top of the thumb. And I'm only connecting it from here down. I'm not connecting it up here. So now we're gonna come back down here and keep stitching in the thumb and the thing where it connects. So I brought my thread up in the center in between those. And then I'm just going to use that as the point where I stitch the glove together. Now I've worked my way down doing the thumb and like stitching it together that way. And now I want it to blend a little bit more. So I'm going to take my thread and stitch all the way across the mitten. And then when I do that, there's going to be a little gap here. And we're going to go back and fill that in with just a few shorter stitches in between. And once that's filled in, I'm just going to fill in the rest of the mitten with the blue. Now the bottom of the mitten is a little bit wavy, so we're going to use some shorter stitches to fill in where there's the gap. All right, and then I'm going to take this snowflake and really simple, I'm just going to stitch over the 6, or I guess the 3 little branches of it with the navy floss. And that first little guy gets a little bit lost, so I'm bringing an extra piece up over the top. Next, we're going to take 3 strands of the gold colored floss that comes with the kit, and we're going to do a satin stitch here on the bottom of the glove. And instead of going side to side this way, we're going to go up and down. Now we're at the snowflake. So to work around this, I'm going to keep stitching over the top in the same direction that I was stitching the rest of the bottom of the glove. And then I'll come back and fill in underneath the snowflake and in between the little things. So you may notice that when I'm stitching back next to the snowflake, I'm sticking the tip of my needle beneath the blue stitches, and that's going to help the blue stand out a little bit against the gold. Now I'm just going to go back and make sure that I filled in between all of the ends of the snowflake and get the snowflake to stand out as much as possible from the background. So I have 3 strands of light blue floss, and we're going to do a brick stitch on this mitten. It's going to be easiest to do the brick stitch if we start down here more in the center of the mitten so that we have a full line to work from. So a brick stitch is basically just a fill stitch done with a back stitch. And on my other videos, I've shown how to do a back stitch before, but to review, you take your stitch and then you bring the thread up in the last spot where you placed it and go back down. And with the brick stitch, you want to be very consistent on your thread lengths. So I'm actually going to redo that stitch, and to do that I just pull my needle off the end of the thread and pull it out again from the bottom. Then I'll just rethread this end. And continue like nothing ever happened. So once we have our first row set, we're gonna come on the bottom and do the same thing, but this time the stitches are gonna be placed offset from the row above it. So I'm coming up in the center of the stitch above and back down. And then when you get to the ends of the rows, you're going to have just the little short stitches that fill in the ends. And since I've got that established now, I'm going to take my thread and fill the top, and then I'm going to fill all the way down the mitten. So now I've finished all of the brick stitch down to the end of the mitten, and I'm going to keep going down to the base of the mitten. I am going to leave a gap in this because I'm going to come back and make another row in between. It's not a full gap, like we don't want it to be super noticeable, but I want to have enough room to do the next set of stitches. So the last thing we're going to add on this mitten is a row of French knots. We're going to use 2 strands of the light pink floss, and we're gonna go in that little gap we left earlier in between the rows of the brick stitches. So I'm just doing a couple wraps with, again, the 2 strands of floss. And I'm gonna make these French knots go all the way across this row. For this next glove, we are gonna do a chain stitch and alternate colors on each stripe. In our other videos, I've gone more in depth on how to do a chain stitch, but the basics are that you start a stitch like I did over here, you come up, and then right next to it, you come back down. Before you close off the stitch, you add another one in between like this. So I have the round here, and I'm going to come back up and pull it down. And then on the last chain stitch in a set, instead of doing another one in between, you do a little stitch on the outside of the circle or of the loop, and then just add like a little tack stitch here at the end. And I'm going to go back and just kind of like push the stitches together, make sure they look pretty consistent across. And then I'm going to skip a line and come back down here and do the same thing. All right, now while I'm down here and I have extra navy thread, I'm going to start filling in the bottom cuff of the mitten. So again, I just have 2 strands of navy blue floss on, and I'm going to use the blue to fill in the cuff. And I'm just using a satin stitch. Next, I'm going to use 2 strands of the lighter blue floss, and we're going to go the opposite direction of the chain stitch. So I started all my chains in the navy blue on this side. We're going to start all of these ones on this side. Then I'm going to skip a line because I'm going to come back and fill in with pink. And we're going to go down here. Oh, and this one actually goes into the thumb. So we'll start over on the thumb part. And this is something interesting. So sometimes when you pull up a thread, it pulls up a little chunk or a little piece of another color. To fix it, you just pull it back down, and then you don't have like a random navy blue piece in the middle of your other colors. So I've gone back and filled in all of the pink stripes now, and this is like a really fun texture, and I think it just looks awesome. So now we're going to move up to this glove, and this one is going to be a satin stitch like this, but instead of how we did this snowflake, we're going to do this one a little bit differently. So it's bigger and it is a little easier to do it this way. So I'm going to fill in the satin stitch until I get to the snowflake. And I am using 3 strands of white floss for this one. Now that we're at the snowflake, we're going to imitate the same direction of the stitches, but we're going to leave a gap for the snowflake itself. So I'm just leaving a really small spot undone so that I can come back and fill this in with another color. And then you'll just do the same thing when you get to these outer points too. It's easiest if you just keep working down the same line and it keeps your stitch directions consistent, and it keeps your amount of stitches consistent. Once your white is filled in, we're going to just fill in the snowflake. So I'm going to start up here at the top. I have 3 strands of the light blue floss, and I'm going to stitch every arm of the snowflake into the middle. Now that I have that all stitched in, I'm going to go around to each end and add a little French knot. And that is just 1 wrap around the needle, just to give it some more texture. And then we'll add 1 in the center. And since you brought all of the arms of the snowflake into the center, it's kind of thick. And so you'll only really have room to make a French knot that has 1 wrap, or else it'll get really hard to pull through the fabric. And then next we're going to fill in the cuff with just a whole bunch of French knots. I'm going to use 2 strands of floss, but all different amounts of wraps for filling that in. So in all of our kits, we use a semi-permanent ink, which means that when we print it on the fabric, it's going to fade, but it doesn't always disappear completely. So if you notice while you're stitching that some of the pattern starts to kind of like fade, all you have to do is take a pen. It can be a heat erasable pen, a fabric pen, or even just, this is just a normal ballpoint pen. And I like to just fill in where it's starting to disappear a little bit. And as long as you stay on the lines that are already there, then you won't be able to see it through your embroidery. So on this glove, we're going to start with the white snowflake pattern. And we're going to just stitch it in. I have 3 strands of white floss on right now. So I'm just using a simple straight stitch, and I'm putting the snowflake ends right next to each other, like not in the exact same hole where they came up, but right next to it. So first I'm doing the X's, and then I'm going to come back and do the stitch over the top. And then while I have my white floss on, I'm just going to fill this in. We're going to do the cuff with a satin stitch. But you see this little stripe, we're going to leave that empty so that we can fill it in with the yellow and kind of match it to the top. I'm going to fill in this mitten with a split stitch, and instead of just doing a single split stitch like I've shown on other videos where you do like trace a line with a split stitch, we're going to use it as a fill stitch, and it's pretty fun to see how the texture turns out with these. So I start with just 1 stitch here, and then I'm going to bring my needle up right in between those 2 threads, and I'm using 2 strands of the gold colored thread that comes with the kit. And it's called a split stitch because we're splitting that stitch. So here's the first one laid in place, and I'm gonna just like go in vertical lines and build my split stitch all the way down. It's best to vary the length of your stitches in this, and that'll give the best texture. Now on this part where the thumb and the main part of the mitten connect, all you have to do is kind of just blend the stitches together. So we have the straight ones coming down from this part of the glove, and then we have the thumb, and I'm just going to bring a stitch up here, and we'll stitch in between that one. And the more you vary these lengths and the placements and everything, the more texture this mitten is going to have. Now that I've finished up the main part of the mitten, we're going to come down here and add in this little stripe. I'm going to do it the same way that I was doing it up top, but this time we're going to go horizontally instead of vertically. And we're just going to fill in this little stripe, and I'll go back and forth as many times as I need to fill it in. Next, I'm going to move to this last mitten, and this one's going to be all pink. The bottom cuff is what we're going to do first. So this is a woven rose stitch, and when we're doing these stitches, it's really a good idea to make sure that we start with these instead of the chain stitch up here, because when you're making the weaving part, it can the needle can catch on other stitches, and we don't want that. So we'll start by stitching lines over the spokes. And I mentioned before, in our other tutorial videos, I cover more of some of the basics of hand embroidery, and that is a really good foundation and a good place to start before you practice these different techniques that I show here in this video. So make sure you grab, if you want to get this kit, make sure you grab the other kit, the stitch sampler, and you'll be able to build your skills up super fast. Now that we have this stitched, I am gonna bring my needle up right next to the center, not in the center, but next to the center, and I'm gonna weave the rows. So you just take the needle and you place it underneath the spokes and you alternate it. So once all your roses are stitched in, we're going to take some floss and just do some in-between stitches to finish out the cuff. I'm going to kind of follow the same shape as the roses on where I add these stitches so that it looks more natural. Then to finish off this mitten, we're going to use a chain stitch, which is what we used over here. But this time I have 4 strands of the light pink floss, and instead of going horizontal, we're going to go vertical. And I want this to imitate how a glove looks when it's crocheted. And so I want to do like big chunky stitches, and the texture is going to be so fun. I thought I'd touch on how to handle when you run out of floss in the middle of a chain stitch. The solution's really simple. All you do is tuck it like you do at the top or at the end of a chain stitch. You just bring up 1 stitch, tuck it in, tie it off, and then when you restart, you just pretend like you're still going, like you didn't stop at all. And that 1 stitch, especially when we're using 4 strands of embroidery floss, that might feel a little bulky, but as you keep going, it will even out and you won't even notice. And you'll see that I did this over here. Just to explain this technique a little bit, I'm bringing the top ends of this stitch close to where the end of the thumb comes together. So I turned that last stitch so that when the rest of them meet, they'll all come together nicely. And then for this part, I'm actually starting in the middle of 2 stitches that were not connected, and I'll go straight up the center of the thumb. The very last thing I'm going to do on this project is I have 2 strands of white floss, and I'm going to make a little French knot in the center of each of these roses. So I'm just using 2 strands and 2 wraps on the side pieces, and then in the center I'm going to use 3 wraps around the needle.